In this video, we're going to go through a quick introduction to the mQuery, the Mashup language in Power Query Editor. We're going to go through what it is, how it differs from DAX, and we're going to go through its basic structure so that you will know how to read and write it for yourself. All of that and more. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, my name is Fernan and welcome to the Solutions Abroad YouTube channel, where we cover tips, tricks, and best practices when working with Power BI. I upload new videos every week, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified when a new one is out. So the first step that typically happens when you're working with Power BI reports is getting the data and transforming it. Whether it be renaming columns, grouping your data, or even combining it with other data sources, the majority of these actions happen within the Power Query Editor. So if you're working with Power BI reports, you must have come across this feature already, because this is where you create your transformation steps and clean your data in a very visual way. All of this visual transformation that you do in Power Query Editor is powered by the Mashup Query Language, most commonly known as the mQuery. Now, Power Query Editor does a really good job at abstracting this mQuery. And in fact, if you're a beginner, you really won't find the need or a lot of scenarios in which you will need to write your mQueries yourself, because most of the time you can do everything using the Power Query Editor and it will just generate the mQueries for you. However, there are some scenarios in which even knowing a little bit of how the mQueries are structured can really help you squeeze as much usefulness from the mQuery as you can. So today I'm going to cover sort of the basic elements of the mQuery itself and some of the ways that you can use it for yourself. So let's go through the sample reports that I prepared for you today, which is the usual Northwind dataset. So it's a small sample set of data that we use for a fictional company that sells grocery goods internationally. So this data model is already pre-created. So it has a bunch of things already like tables and relationships, and it has some visuals. And I want to go through Power Query Editor just to show you, kind of give you an idea of how it looks like and how we can kind of tweak it. So Power Query Editor is something, if you didn't know yet, you access by clicking Transform Data from Power BI Desktop. So if you click on it, it will open up this Power Query Editor, which will give you this view. So this is where you will transform your data, usually by right-clicking or clicking. It's basically all visual transformation, so you don't really need to write anything. So all of the transformations that you do gets translated into steps in Power Query. So this is the steps that you see here on the right-hand side, the applied steps. So it's in chronological order from top to bottom. So each step defines how that query has been changed and into a chain. So in this case, for example, if we go one step up, it gets its data from the Northwind database that I have installed. This navigation step looks for the specific table within that database that I want to use for this query. And then the last step basically just removes other columns apart from what we have here in this table. So you will get a snippet of how the mQuery looks like. When you have any of the steps selected here, you will see the mQuery sort of shown here in the formula bar if you don't have it, if you have it enabled. Or if you want to see the whole mQuery that powers the whole query itself, you can simply hit Advanced Editor and it will show you the whole query itself, showing all of the steps and what it's doing. What you'll notice though is that the syntax of this mQuery is completely different from DAX, and that's because these two languages serve different purposes in the context of developing reports in Power BI. So at its most basic use, the M code is basically what you use to prep and clean your data before it gets loaded into the semantic model, whereas the DAX is something that you use to create calculations that is dynamic based on the context that you present it in your reports. So think of it like this. The M code is what you use to pre-process the data before it gets loaded into the semantic model. So it's a way for you to clean that data up into something that is reportable. And then the DAX is what you use to calculate it and present it afterwards. So now that you understand the difference between those two languages, let's go back to the M code itself so I can explain to you a couple of things. So we left off looking at the advanced editor, and this is basically all of the steps that build your query into what it is now. So what it's showing here in the end product of this query. So what that means is that having all of this code and copying it into a new query will basically copy your query. If I just copy this, for example, and let's create a new source, we'll do blank query. And then since it's blank, we'll hit advanced editor and we will just simply paste the query that we've just copied. And as you can see, it basically mimics the product queries because it has all of the steps, as you can see on the right hand side. And it's all driven by the M query that we have copied and pasted. So how do you actually read this M query in the advanced editor? So I'm not going to explain everything because it's such a big topic, M query by itself. So I'm going to just explain the basic structure of how a typical M query looks like so that you can kind of read it and understand what's happening yourself. So first of all, what you'll notice is that there are two things here that are highlighted as blue. So the let, which basically defines where all of the transformation in your query happens. So in this case, it's these 3 lines. And each of these lines represents a step in your query. So source, there's the first step there. Then you have the navigation, which is the second one. And then the removed other columns, which is the third step. In is simply the result or the end product of your query. So which step should be the last step in this query for it to present its data. So it's currently referencing the removed other columns because this is the last step that we have in our steps. But obviously, if you have more steps or it ends into a different column, that will be the result here. Each step here, as we looked at, is represented as an expression by itself. So you'll see that it's prefixed with the name first equals and then what is actually happening in that step. So that kind of pattern you will notice for the majority of the steps that happens. So the second one, for example, here is the name equals and then what's happening in that step. So looking for the products, for example. And then the third one, removed other columns, that's the name equals and what is actually happening in that step. The steps are separated by comma. So just to give them a sort of delimitation, except the last step itself. So the last step just it goes into the in, and then that's what it will be. The last step will be referenced in the in part of the M query. So what happens and what is written in each of the steps actually differ depending on what the steps are actually doing. And this is not typically something that you would write for yourself by hand. It's something that the Power Query editor generates for you. You just simply do what you want to do in the visual transformations part. However, I think it's important to at least understand this basic structure so that if you want to make changes or some simple changes for yourself, you can do it directly in the advanced editor. So for example, let's go back to, let's cancel this. And let's say I want to rename this category ID to category maybe cat ID. So what it does when I did that, I just double clicked and renamed that column. It adds a new step, renamed columns. And if you look at the advanced editor, it just adds that new step for us without us having to worry about syntax or things like this. And as you can see, it's created the M query for us that renames a column from whatever it was before, category ID to cat ID. So you can do all of this visual transformation yourself here, or if you wanted to make some quick changes, you can do it directly in the M query itself. So maybe we just want to call this one category. If you hit enter, as you can see, that gets updated in the preview here that you get. So this is typically useful if you have queries that have a lot of data. And I find that in the past, if I have a lot of steps or working with a big set of data, the preview that is being shown in the visual part of Power Query Editor, it takes a long time to load. So being able to understand how the M query works and make these basic changes directly in the steps themselves just makes my life or my development process a little bit quicker. Now that you know the absolute basics of M query and M code, let's have a look at a couple of scenarios in which knowing at least the basic structure of M query will help you or have helped me in the past. So the first example is being able to create your own custom columns. So let me just delete this query and let's go back. Let's go to one of my more simpler tables here, the categories table. So this is what it's showing. So it's a very simple table. It has 2 columns, and we're going to focus on the category name. So let's say we want to have a new column. We want a new column called category, just category. I want to take the first 2 letters of the category name, uppercase them, and name this new column category. So knowing how the visual transformations work in Power Query Editor, how would you do that? It's actually pretty simple because it provides you with all of the tools that you need to make that happen. So if you go to add column, for example, if you go to extract first characters, take the first 2 characters fairly easily. You right click that and you go transform, uppercase, and then you name this one category. Fairly simple, right? So it just gave me exactly what I wanted. But the problem is that all of these steps that we did are all in 3 different steps here. So just because we had to do everything visually and in a step-by-step format, it just means that it's done in steps, in separate individual steps instead of being one. And one of the best practices that I try to follow when I'm working in Power Query Editor is to keep the steps to a minimum if I can, just because it's a lot easier to manage. And if you knew a little bit of mQuery or mcode, you would be able to do this in just 1 step. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna delete all of these steps that we have just created, and we're just gonna click the new custom column here on the ribbon. We're gonna call this one category, and then in the custom column formula, we're gonna start by writing text start. So give me the first 2 characters from the category name, and then I'm going to wrap that with text.upper, which will basically just capitalize all of the texts that we wrap it in. So if we hit OK here, so as you can see, it's done the exact same thing, but except it's done it in 1 step, which is just the custom column using mQuery. And by the way, all of these functions that I used is something that I'm familiar with because I already know how these functions work, but there is a full catalog of all of the functions that you can use with Power Query formulas. It's a Microsoft documentation, and it has a full catalog of everything that you can use, the summary of it, its remarks, how it reacts. So fairly similar to how the DAX documentation works. So if you want to kind of browse that, I'll leave a link to that documentation kind of library in the description box below. Okay, so let's have a look at our second scenario here. So let's go to the test table here. So this is a test table that I have created. It has 2 columns, fairly simple, order ID and order date. And what you'll notice is that we also have another one here, the orders query, which also has order ID and order date. So let's say we want to, okay, let's do this. So let's go to my test table. Let's do a couple of things here. So maybe I want to split this into a few columns. So let's do split delimiter. I want to name this one date. I want to name this one month. I want to name this one year. And I want to change all of their type to a whole number. And then I want to name this one order ID. Like this. Okay, let's just imagine that there are a lot more steps than this. I was just trying to add as many steps as I can. And we want to do all of those steps to the orders query. So let's say this test table, we want to do the exact same thing in this query without necessarily having to do everything that we've done just now. So having to right click the limiter. We just want to simply copy all of those steps and apply it to this order query. Now, if you know at least the very basics of how mQuery works, you will know how to copy and paste those steps and apply it to this other query. So let's go through exactly that, right? So let's first go back to our test table here. And we know from the steps that the first step that we changed or did is the split column. So this is the step that we need to copy from. So if we hit advanced editor, let's copy all of the steps from the bottom all the way to the split column by delimiter. So this is the step where it starts. So if you hit copy there, and then we go to the orders query, hit advanced editor, let's delete the last part here, the in, and then let's paste that new set of steps. I'm just going to align it so that we can see it. And just remember that there's a red squiggly line here, and that's because each step is delimited by a comma. Remember that. So I'll just make sure that it's delimited. It's saying that there's no syntax errors detected. You just want to make sure that the steps are referencing the step before it. So for example, here, since we have change type, it's just referencing that step before it. So that there shouldn't be any errors in this. So if we hit done, as you can see, there we go. It applies all of the steps that we have done in the test table in this new orders table that we have without having to necessarily do all of the steps ourselves. It's simply just a copy and paste job. Lastly, I wanted to cover briefly custom functions, which is a pretty interesting part of mQuery that lets you kind of reuse steps by kind of invoking them. And I have covered it in several videos in the past, specifically around kind of data scraping or looping through paginated queries. And it's a really interesting topic to cover. So if you want to learn more about a custom query, or at least its practical applications, I will leave a link to it somewhere in this video. So let's start by creating a custom query. So let's start by creating a blank query first. And I'm just gonna create something totally kind of random just to show you the basic premise of how to create functions and how you would use them. So let's first generate an array of numbers. So let's generate 1 to 5. So here it generates us a list of values from 1 to 5. I just use curly brackets to kind of do an array. So we'll convert that into a table like this, and it just basically returns us a list of numbers between 1 to 5. So very, very simple. So let's say we want to convert this query into a custom function. So let's rename this first. Let's say get expand count. Not really, no, it just expands and creates new rows based on the number of, based on this array that we have created here. So 1 up to 5, right? So now that I've renamed that, let's go to the advanced editor and let's convert this into a function. So you convert this into a function, first of all, by defining a parameter that your users need to give it. So in this case, we want to give count. Then we'll use equals greater than, and what it does, so your user will give it a number, and then in the source here we'll replace the 5, which is the max count. We'll replace this with a count, which is what our users give us. So based on the number that they give us, we'll generate a list of set of numbers. So fairly easy. So when we hit done, what you will notice is it gets converted into a custom function. So it's now an fx here in its icon instead of the usual table. So this is what happens. So let's have a look at one of my tables here. Let's look at the test table itself. So I'm just gonna delete all of the things that we did earlier. And so we have order ID here. And what we'll do is we're gonna try to invoke the function that we've just created. So add column, invoke custom function. We're gonna leave this one custom, doesn't matter. We'll choose the expand count as our function query. And as you can see here, it's asking us for a count. So in this case, we want to use, let's just use the order ID because this is just a number. So if we hit OK, as you can see, it does some sort of merge to the function. And if we expand this, so this is what it does, right? So you'll notice that for each of the orders, it created us a new list based on the number that we have in that order ID. So the second row, for the first one, for example, just gave us just 1 because there's only 1 here, but the second one gave us 2 rows because there's 2 in that order ID, and so on and so on. So that's sort of the basic way of how you kind of create custom functions. So this one specifically not too useful, but being able to create your own custom functions that you can reuse in the future is extremely important to a skill to have. And that's really it for this video. So I hope you now have some sort of basic knowledge on how mCode or mQuery works, because it's not really just something that is useful only for Power BI. It's also useful to use in other softwares within the Microsoft ecosystem. So also typical data prep solutions like, the data flows. I use it quite a lot on data flows in Excel. This is also available in Excel, and the Dataverse, I believe. So knowing how it works here means that you can use all of those other solutions. So it's a pretty useful skill to have. Thanks for watching. As usual, give this video a like if you found it useful. Give it a dislike if you didn't, so to do better for next time. Ask your questions in the comment section box below so I can help you and you can help others. If you like this video, we have a Patreon page where you can support the channel and get exclusive perks like early access, demo files, and credits at the end of these videos. Thanks again for watching and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.